Hi, I'm Victoria Dougherty, and welcome to Love at First Right. I am a blogger and historical thriller writer who is endeavoring to write a great epic romance. And this week we're going to be talking about marriage. Obviously, not every romance has to have a marriage in it, but I think that we really had to address this because so many romances do have, from Jane Austen, all the way on down, so many great romances, and either in a marriage or in the promise of a marriage. And if that's not in it, then marriage somehow hovers unspoken in the story. The promise of always, the promise of true love, of standing in front of your community and saying, I take this man, I take this woman. So, um, I want to start off with talking a little bit about love stories. Years ago, it was about a week before I was supposed to be getting married. Actually, I was at work and I was listening to the radio, which is something that I did at work a lot. At the time, I was listening to Talk of the Nation, which was on NPR, and it hasn't been on in a few years, but it was this great 2-hour show that would, usually focus on one big topic. And that week, it focused on marriage. And they had this expert on marriage, and this is sort of the preeminent expert on marriage in the world. For our purposes today, we'll call him Dr. Marriage because I can't remember his name. But I remember some of the things that Dr. Marriage said really stuck with me as a writer. And one of them was that one of the most important components to a successful marriage is the story of us, of how we came together. And he said it's so important that you can tell if a marriage can be saved or if it is truly over. If you ask the couple to tell the story of how they met, and they can tell that story with any pleasure or joy, if they can't, he says, then that marriage is truly over. And I just thought that was absolutely fascinating because I think for every, successful and happy relationship that I know, and maybe even some that aren't so happy, the story of us is a really big part of them. It certainly is in my own marriage of, that we met in this, candlelit 400-year-old pub in Prague. And then, I moved, we went our separate ways, and my husband ended up sort of stalking me like a secret admirer. I mean, stalking in a good way, not in the creepy way. And, when we tell the story to our children, it's really quite amazing to see them, to see the looks on their faces, because they then see us in a way that they're not used to seeing us, because we're just kind of going about the day of making their lives good, right? But I thought that was very fascinating. And one of the other things that Dr. Marriage said about relationships was he talked about how important a moral component was to a long-term relationship, meaning that people who came together, their story perhaps started with infidelity. Maybe they met when they were both married to other people or something like that. He said that those relationships have a much harder slog ahead of them. It's not that they can't be successful. Of course, there are all sorts of different kinds of relationships, and there are all sorts of mitigating circumstances. But that, it's one of the reasons why that's so hard is because, for one, it's hard to tell that story. Oh, how did you two meet? Well, I was at Little Gym, and there was this other woman there, and she was an aerobics instructor, and she was really hot. And I was with my 2-year-old, and then I don't know, one thing led to another, and I was having an affair. It's hard to tell that story because you kind of imagine the way people look at you then, like, oh, you know. But it's also, I think, hard. That's a hard story to tell ourselves. Um, that we failed, that we came together in a way that maybe hurt others, or hurt ourselves, hurt our children. And there has to be a really good reason to do something like that. And certainly there are very good reasons to leave a marriage and to go into a different relationship. I'm not saying that, but I think that what he was saying is very interesting. That it's one of the reasons why that story part is so important. I mean, there's a reason why we say Mr. Right, and Ms. Right, and there is a moral aspect of the word right. And I think that marriage is so much a part of that. Marriage, the vows in a marriage they're so aspirational, and they are so moral, and they are so about the good of our society, the good of the family, that I think that it is very, very hard to get away from that in any significant way in a romance. I think that the presence absolutely must be there, at least the promise of that presence. For instance, I have a friend who got married very young, and the circumstances of her marriage were very interesting because she was in a very serious and committed relationship with her boyfriend, but they certainly were not ready to get married. But they did, they just went to a justice of the peace and did it, very, very quietly, because her boyfriend was not American. And he was having a hard time getting a green card, and they didn't want to break up, but they didn't really want to get married. So they called it, we got legally married. We've been legally married because, we wanted to be together, but we weren't, ready to stand up in front of our community and say, I take this man, I take this woman. But what was so interesting about it was, as we, talked about their relationship throughout the years, so she said, it is different though. We told everyone we've been legally married. We were very clear with our families about our intentions, but the fact is we were married. And we were living as married people, and people saw us as a couple. And even if that was not the intention of our vows, I mean, it was their intention, I think, later on, it became our intention, and it became the reality. I thought that was very interesting, and I think it's very true because anytime I've ever had to stand up and take any kind of oath or vow, which I had to do when I got my passport, it triggers something in you. Putting your hand up and saying, yeah, yes, saying I promise, it means something. It means something, I think, on both a conscious and a subconscious level, because it is just so much a part of who we are. I think that as we are endeavoring to write our romances, either metaphorically or quite literally, we have to be writing about marriage. We have to be writing about the vows that we take in marriage. And I think that we have to be constructing our lover's relationship as if it were a marriage, with the aspirations of the best kind of marriage. I take thee. I give thee my body. I give thee all of my worldly possessions, to have and to hold from this day forward, in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer. These are incredibly powerful words, and they are incredibly powerful plot points. I think that even just taking the vows, if you configure your plot around the marriage vows, in sickness and in health, for richer, for poor, to have and to hold, all of this, and you make them plot points, you will make very naturally a very compelling romance, even if there is no mention of marriage in this story at all. The vows we make, it is the essence, I think, of any really powerful relationship, especially if you're endeavoring to write, an epic romance. I think that an epic romance, I'm thinking of something like Twilight, which is a saga. I think that sagas, I think it would be very difficult to have a saga, to have a series without a wedding in it, without some sort of vow taking. for the characters. A standalone romance, I think, can certainly survive in the moment. It can be about the way these lovers fell in love, and does not have to. It can end maybe with the promise of a future, with hope for the future, but doesn't have to end actually in. There doesn't have to be an actual ceremony in it. But I think that when we're endeavoring to write a series, which I am, it is probably in our best interest to sneak a marriage in there, and actually not even sneak it in, make a marriage a very big deal in at least one of the books, and in at least one of the scenes, and bring these characters together in such a way that they are now both legally and spiritually bound to one another. Um, and Now, I think even if you are not writing a romance, but you are writing a series that has a romance in it. I mean, I think of The Hunger Games, which is certainly not a romance. I mean, it's a dystopian thriller, a young adult dystopian thriller, and yet the relationships, the romance part of that series is an incredibly powerful part of the series, and the relationship between Katniss and Peeta rests on one word: always. She is lying there during one part of the story, and something. Gosh, I don't even remember the context, but something has happened, and she is lying there, and she says, "Stay with me," and she just hears him say, "Always." And that becomes repetitive in that story. I think they say it at least two or three times to one another, and it becomes their thing. Always. And I think that always is beautifully loaded, and it means so much to another person to say, "I will be with you always." It is the gold standard of what we are always looking for, reaching for, wanting in our own lives when we think of love. I mean, who of us says for a while? you know, we're all searching for that always person, and I think that certainly when we're writing a romance, but even when we're writing from a different genre, um, and we have a significant romance in it, I think that we must endeavor to promise always, and to communicate to the reader in a variety of ways, to pull that reader along and make that reader care about this relationship. Because when we are writing a marriage, something that is like a marriage, a really committed relationship, your reader is committing with you. Your reader is taking those vows with you. And so uh, I think that it's worth going back and really reading marriage vows. There's I found a great site which lists the marriage vows for really every major religion. And so if this topic interests you, I highly recommend that. Go back, go to Google, look up traditional wedding vows and really read them. And I also recommend reading the Song of Solomon in the Bible. But anyway, until next time, and I thought I would bring Barney up because he has been making noise throughout this so that you don't think that's my stomach gurgling or me snorting and farting and doing all of the things that Barney has been doing. Thank you. Bye.